The Bay is what I suppose you would call a found footage film, but in structure, I'd just call it a horror mockumentary. It's about a mysterious outbreak in a coastal town that all seems to center around the fish in the bay. The story is set several years after the outbreak ravages the city, and we see leftover footage cobbled together from the one young student reporter who happened to be there covering a different story. Found footage is always, or often intentionally, made to look cheap, so it's a great entry point. But as a result, a lot of found footage is also extremely sloppy, lazy, and amateurish. This one, though, is really stellar. There are some truly terrifying moments that use the found footage gimmick at its best. The story itself also certainly hits a little harder after a couple years of a global pandemic where nobody could quite figure out what was going on, but this also meets the body horror angle in a really effective and interesting way. Definitely a horror movie I would suggest folks check out if they haven't seen it. It totally works for me. Paid stars a very young Joan Crawford as a woman who was sent away to prison for a crime she didn't commit. When she's finally let out, she vows to take her revenge on the male species as a whole by running a series of scams in which she romances older men and then sues them for breach of contract. While the plot for this one didn't really stand out among the surprisingly large number of women in prison stories from 1930 that I've seen so far, Joan Crawford is very good in it, unsurprisingly. She's definitely leaning into an earlier, more 1930s style of melodramatic film acting, but there is a genuineness to her portrayal that makes her character really relatable, and it's easy to root for her as she goes about her nefarious plans. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it to those who aren't already Crawford fans, as it doesn't offer a whole lot else than her performance, but she is worth checking out in this. The Ice Storm is a talky family drama that feels very much like a Tennessee Williams kind of script, where all the characters are miserable and all of them are having affairs with everybody else, and I just don't care about any of them. This is despite a really solid cast, including Sigourney Weaver and Kevin Kline and a young Elijah Wood and Christina Ricci. I did have medium-high hopes for this one, but it all just kind of sits in such a drudgery that I couldn't really get into it. For this kind of thing to work, I have to either really intellectually care about the themes, or find a connection to the characters in some way, or be given smart and thoughtful dialogue, and while I could see this attempting to do all three of those things, none of them ever really land. I'm not sure this is a bad movie so much as just one that is absolutely not for me. I would definitely be curious to hear from people who are big fans of this one because it feels like something that would have fans. I'm just not one of them. The Deep was next on my Peter Yates watch list. It tells the story of a couple on a diving expedition on their vacation who discover some mysterious artifacts that then get them entangled in the middle of a big dramatic smuggling plot. There are definitely some nice tense scenes involving the efforts to find more artifacts under the water, but my enjoyment of the film was largely hampered by how unlikable a character our lead is. He's played by Nick Nolte, who I've never been a huge fan of, but here he really leans into the ugly American stereotypes in a way where I'm mostly just rooting for him to lose the artifact and get sent back home. I will admit this is mostly a personal preference, that his character just entirely rubs me the wrong way and I can't quite get over it. It might be worth watching the rest of the movie for some of the action sequences, but the plot and the acting and the writing are not going to be what recommends it primarily. This one definitely lands lower on my list of films by Yates. A Woman Under the Influence is a John Cassavetes film starring Peter Falk and Jenna Rollins as a working-class couple with children. Rollins clearly has some mental instability, possibly something like bipolar disorder, given that we see what appear to be both manic and depressive episodes, but whatever it is, Falk has no idea how to deal with it. I have not yet found a Cassavetes film that I like until this one. It's just as early mumblecore as all of his others, but for the first time I could track the characters and their frustrations and their motivations. Jenna Rollins is truly tremendous in this. Her character is clearly so unwell, but all of her husband's suggestions for dealing with it are so obviously going to make things worse, and it's impossible not to be on her side as she desperately tries to keep herself together so that she can stay with her children. There are a slew of other characters, doctors and co-workers and children who fade in and out of the story, but the focus is always on the couple, and they are the ones who really captivate. Absolutely worth a watch. The Black Pirate is a silent action-adventure film starring Douglas Fairbanks as a young man who joins a group of pirates to get revenge for them murdering his father. Silent adventure films are very much not my genre, as I often have difficulty tracking visual movement without any sound to help me process what's going on, but if I'm going to watch a silent adventure film, I absolutely want it to be one that stars Douglas Fairbanks. Everything I've ever seen him in, he is so dynamic, and he uses his physicality to its absolute maximum. He reminds me a little bit, in an odd way, of Toshiro Mifune, another actor who was very skilled at using his physical charisma to heighten the story and the character. Even if the story itself didn't do a lot for me, I'm basically always happy to spend an hour or two watching Fairbanks jump around. A worthwhile performance to watch, even if the movie as a whole didn't quite speak to me. The Forger stars Josh Hutcherson as a troubled teenager whose mom has gone missing, and Alfred Molina as the grumpy, renowned artist who thinks Hutcherson shows some talent. Of course, as the title of the film implies, Molina doesn't actually want to mentor the young painter so much as put him to work on creating art forgeries. For such an interesting cast, including Molina and Lauren Bacall, this actually ends up being a very boring film. The stakes are extremely muddy throughout, and it offers neither insight into these characters' personal development, nor a glimpse into the world of art forgery, or even the world of just being an artist. It's primarily a script problem, so even some very good actors cannot make this work. What we're left with is the most mediocre of mediocre movies that barely even attempts to do anything interesting. This one can be skipped. All Quiet on the Western Front is a 2022 German adaptation of the book of the same name, following a young German soldier and his troop during World War I. It shows the young boys being indoctrinated into agreeing to fight for their country, as well as their loss of idealism once they get into the thick of it and realize that they are just being manipulated for someone else's power grab. I had recently rewatched the 1930 version of this story before watching this one, and while both are good, I think I prefer the earlier version. It digs a little bit more heavily into the psyche of the characters and feels a little less reliant on gruesome battle scenes. That being said, this is a pretty solid movie. I'm not sure if it adds anything to the anti-war film genre that hasn't already been said, although considering that the original book was written by a German, it's nice to get a version finally adapted by German filmmakers. The cinematography is good, the acting is good, there's not much of anything wrong with it. It doesn't feel like a news story by any means, but it's a well-told one. Hollywood's Stargirl is a Disney coming-of-age story about a high schooler who moves to a new town and works to make new friends and follow her dreams of being a musician. This is apparently a sequel to Stargirl, which in turn is based on a fairly well-known young adult novel that I've never read, but I'm curious as to whether the character in the novel is as insufferable as the movie. This is the definition of a manic pixie dream girl, set up initially to be somebody who has trouble connecting with others, but within a day or two of living in a new place has diehard friends because she's just so magical, people are drawn to her. Now, granted, the actress playing her is extremely charismatic and sells the character as much as I think anyone could, and this does feel more like one of Disney's theatrical releases than a straight-to-streaming option in terms of how the story is structured. However, it still is moving so many mountains to make things just fall into place for this character that she never gets an actual character arc that makes any sense. I might have identified more with this when I was the main character's age, but I think even then I would have realized how unrelatable she was to me. Borderline is a 1930 avant-garde film exploring the issue of interracial relationships. For many years, it was considered lost, but a copy was apparently discovered in Switzerland by accident in 1983. It's definitely a very interesting piece of cinema history and probably worth the watch just for that reason alone. That being said, it's not particularly one that I would watch out of narrative interest or outside of its context in the history of film. It's deliberately disjointed and dreamlike, which is a style that holds very little interest for me no matter how it is used. And I have to assume that in alienating me here, it is functioning exactly the way that it wants to. There are certainly many striking visuals here, and the soundtrack that was accompanying it in the version I saw absolutely lends itself to the frustrated chaos of the characters. If any of this sounds interesting to you, it's almost certainly one that you should try to find and check out. If it doesn't, it's probably not going to surprise you by being something it's not. Maria Full of Grace is a story about a 17-year-old girl from Colombia who finds herself unexpectedly pregnant and is shortly thereafter fired from her job. She ultimately decides to take on work as a drug mule to help support herself and her family. This is certainly a harrowing story, and the image of her swallowing these large packages that could burst inside of her at any moment, killing her, is going to stick with me for a long time. The film treads an interesting line between hopelessness and hopefulness, but it doesn't feel at any point like the film is milking it for us to feel bad for these characters. We just see things going badly for them. The slightly distanced viewpoint actually allows me to feel even more connected to these characters, because I don't feel like they're being used to send a message or an idea. While there's obviously not a pure happily ever after for the situation, the story ends with some optimism about the characters, and I appreciated that. The lead actress is really stupendous. I believe she earned an Academy Award nomination for this, and that is well deserved. A worthwhile movie to see. The Unholy Three follows three circus performers, a little person, a ventriloquist, and a strongman, who leave the circus after their sideshow is shut down and band together to commit crimes, disguised as a family running a pet shop. This certainly is a more exciting premise than a lot of the crime films I've seen from 1930, leaning heavily into melodrama and elaborate costumes. For example, the ventriloquist disguises himself as a kindly grandmother and the little person as her baby grandchild. It's a remake of a silent film by Todd Browning, who was later known for the film Freaks, and like that film, the premise of this one treads the line between being respectful of folks who worked at the sideshow and being exploitative. But overall, I think it does a good job of letting them be villains without letting their otherness make them villains. And overall, they come across as full characters more often than not. It's not a film for everyone, but I enjoyed it. It felt different from other films of the era, and I appreciated a story I hadn't seen told yet. Tokyo Godfathers is an animated Japanese film about three homeless people on the streets of Japan who find themselves taking care of an abandoned baby at Christmas time. As they wander around trying to figure out what to do with this child, we learn more about their individual backstories and how they interact with each other. Some of these stories are definitely more interesting than others, but all the stories feel rich, and it did pique my interest in going back to rewatch it sometime. The kindness and love at the center of the film make it a good fit for the holiday season, despite the dark plot lines of loss and poverty at the heart of it. When it comes to my personal reaction, though, it's something I admire more than subjectively enjoy, though I think it's definitely one that could grow on me in another viewing or two, and I would like to give it that chance. Infinity Pool is a difficult movie to describe the plot of without immediately getting into spoilers, but basically it's about a man on vacation in a foreign country who gets in trouble with the law only to find himself drawn into a dark world of reckless cruelty. This is a movie I came to begrudgingly like after reading some analyses of it afterwards, but in the moment of watching it, I found it needlessly confusing and couldn't process what I was supposed to take out of it. After letting it sit and reading other people's takes on it, it clicked a little bit more, and it does make me want to rewatch it with a clearer understanding of the narrative. And regardless of my negative first impression, I want to say that Mia Goth is an absolutely fascinating actress. This was the first thing I've seen her in, and while I didn't love the movie, I definitely wanted to see more of her. She's got such a uniquely charismatic look that she uses to the max in this film, and kept me interested even when I wasn't drawn to the rest of the story. The Trial is a film adaptation of Franz Kafka's story of a man who abruptly finds himself on trial for a crime, but nobody will tell him what he's accused of. This version is directed by Orson Welles and stars Anthony Perkins as the condemned man, although Welles plays an important supporting character. While typically surreal movies aren't my jam, this one definitely evokes a dreamlike sense of terror, at least throughout the first half. It always teases just enough clear answers that it does feel jarring and disorienting when they all just disappear, and I found that effective. The second half got deeper into the philosophy of the story and started losing my interest, but I did find myself more interested in the first half than I anticipated I would be, so that was a nice surprise. Cairo Station is set at a busy train station in Egypt in the 1950s, where we follow the lives of a few vendors at the station. Most notably, a newspaper seller and the beautiful drink vendor he becomes obsessed with, even though she's engaged to another man. This is, to my knowledge, my first Egyptian film I've ever seen, and I found it really captivating. It digs into the characters' darker motivations in a beautifully nuanced way that we don't always see in 1950s cinema. It's a lot more interesting than I found a lot of similar crime drama films to be. Definitely worth watching. The Seagull is an Anton Chekhov play considered a classic, and this version I watched was the filmed version of a production at the National Theatre in the UK. The story centers around a lake home in the country, showing us the artists who live there and visit and form connections with each other. I've never really fallen in love with the original, and I'm more interested in the artistic choices here in the abstract than I am to any of the personal aspects of the play. This production focuses entirely on the text, with the actors sitting in chairs in an empty beige box throughout most of the play. I've also seen Sidney Lumet's more realism-based version of this play, and neither one has really captured my interest. There are just so many things going on and so many threads to follow that I never feel like I can hold on to one of them long enough to care, and that holds true for this version as well. Men Without Women is a curious title for this film because the womanlessness of these men has no bearing on their plight. These men are in fact trapped in a submarine that is running out of oxygen, trying to communicate with the outside world. This is an early John Ford, and while it's not as smooth as some of his later films, it definitely captures the claustrophobia of these men and how easy it is for their panic to lead them to make terrible decisions. It's been rare so far for my 1930 films to really capture much of a sense of tension, but this one is pretty effective at that, as well as helping us get to know some of the individual men trapped down there so we can be rooting for them on a personal level. Definitely one of the better thrillers that I've watched in this particular project. Bodies, Bodies, Bodies is a horror comedy about a group of friends spending a weekend at their cabin in the woods who begin to be murdered one by one. This movie got a lot of attention for being extremely Gen Z, and it absolutely is. From the slang to the ever-present social media to the constant clarification that people are on the right side of social issues. And while it's lampooning all that, it doesn't feel like it's doing it in a mean-spirited way. Instead, it just ends up being a funny, dark horror comedy. And some of the final climactic scenes where characters learn the truth about each other are truly hilarious. And I'm quite pleased with the way that it ended. It all just made sense. A fun ride, if one that sometimes feels a little much, but it wouldn't at all be the same movie if you toned it down. The War Zone is a British drama focusing on a teenage boy who finds out that his older sister is in an incestuous relationship with their father, and how this knowledge begins to tear the family apart. This is a very difficult movie to watch, unsurprisingly, with that plot. The core three actors, Laura Belmont, Ray Winstone, and Freddie Conliffe, turn in some really tremendous performances that make this an even tougher watch because they feel like such real, fleshed-out characters. The script doesn't quite stick the landing, and I can't actually imagine wanting to watch it again due to the unpleasant subject matter, but I do think it's mostly pretty well done. Them tells the story of a small town in the desert plagued by mysterious deaths, and the team of scientists and researchers who come in to investigate. While it's pretty well known in pop culture what the cause of all this is, the movie itself doesn't reveal it until much later in the film, so I'll keep it a surprise in my review. The opening scene with the police picking up a terrified, silent young girl wandering along in the desert sets a haunting tone that the rest of the movie doesn't quite hold, but it's still very good. While the dialogue occasionally gets heavy-handed, the movie excels in crafting a sense of mystery with how skillfully it's paced. And it was delightful to see a female researcher given as much expertise as her peers, despite also being objectified by other men around her. This was the first in a series of movie recommendations given to me along the theme of horror movies with social commentary, and it fit that bill perfectly. Definitely worth watching. Tucker and Dale vs. Evil revolves around two well-intentioned hillbillies, the titular Tucker and Dale, whose vacation takes a nightmarish turn when a series of misunderstandings lead a group of college kids to believe they're psycho killers. The film's comedy really leans into the farcical nature of these misunderstandings with fatal consequences, and it works perfectly. At least one of the death scenes got a genuine out-loud laugh from me. But more surprisingly, the movie stands out for its unexpected depth of empathy. While it plays with the country versus city stereotypes, it portrays both Tucker and Dale as relatable and endearing characters, while also giving the city kids more complexity than mere caricatures would get. This blend of humor, horror, and heart is perfectly balanced, with comedic moments complementing rather than detracting from the tension. Overall, I'm glad I finally got around to watching Tucker and Dale. It is a delightful and refreshing horror comedy, proving that a twisted premise and genuine empathy can make for a strangely charming horror experience. Nate and Hayes is an adventure film that follows swashbuckling pirate Captain Bully Hayes and his unexpected companion Nate Williams as they navigate treacherous waters and dangerous foes in the South Pacific. This was part of my watch-through of John Hughes' screenwriting credits, and I definitely noticed traces of his comedic style sprinkled throughout. Tommy Lee Jones's portrayal of a pirate is unusual at best, but kind of fascinating, and the film commendably leans into a buddy comedy trope that doesn't rely on which of us gets the girl. However, despite these unique elements, Nathan Hayes suffers from a lack of depth and ultimately doesn't leave much of an impression. Worse, the film's take on race definitely has not aged well, and it makes several of the scenes of our characters cavorting around quote-unquote exotic locations nearly unwatchable. At best, it's bland. At worst, it's actively unpleasant. The People Under the Stairs is a horror film that follows Fool, a young boy who becomes entangled in a nightmarish journey when he breaks into a seemingly abandoned house to steal a valuable coin. The film masterfully weaves social commentary and horror, creating a thought-provoking but terrifying narrative. Fool stands out among other protagonists in the genre for not only his intelligence, but especially his empathy. These traits add depth to the story and make his survival a compelling focal point. Much of the film's brilliance lies in its restraint, revealing only fragments of the disturbing backstory at a time. This enhances the horror, as it lets our imagination fill in the gaps. Another one of the film's strengths is its unexpectedly empowering conclusion, which is a very satisfying resolution. This contrast to traditional horror endings sets The People Under the Stairs apart, leaving viewers with a sense of hope and victory. I really have to pay more attention to Wes Craven's filmography. This film showed me that he can create a film that is both chilling and thought-provoking in all the right ways. Borrowed Wives is a 1930 comedy about a man who is set to receive an inheritance from his grandfather as long as he is married by a certain time. He has plans to do so, but his fiancée's plane is delayed, and he is forced to find another woman to pose as his new wife at the last minute, and chaos ensues. The plot and stakes in this one are beautifully simple, and they have a great deal of fun playing with all the different ways this could go wrong. It's not an incredible or terribly memorable film. I didn't walk out of this film remembering any of the specific jokes, but I did have a general sense of having had a good time, and sometimes that's all you need from your movies. It feels very much like one of those infinite, playful mysteries that local community theaters put on as a reliable crowd pleaser. That's what it is.